Thanks everyone for joining us this evening to talk about Northwestern's draft integrated resource plan. Um, I am Nick Fitzmaurice. For those that don't know me, I'm the energy transition engineer with the Montana Environmental Information Center. Um, Joining me is going to be Kyle Unruh with Renewable Northwest to talk a little more about some of the details. But I'll start sharing here and we can kick it off. If everyone can see my screen, then we'll keep going. So yeah, Northwestern Energy just came out with its draft 2026 IRP. It was released to the public, I believe, last Friday. I've been a member of Northwestern's stakeholder group as this plan has been developed, as well as Kyle Unruh has been a member of that group. Derek with Northwest Energy Coalition, who's on this call, as well as a number of our other partners. Some may also be on. So we've been digging into a lot of the modeling results that have come out of this and want to share what's going on as we approach the public meetings Northwestern will be holding in the coming weeks. But before getting into that, I guess, yeah, just I'll flag this now and I'll flag it at the end, what these public meetings are, because we want to make sure folks can turn out wherever they are located. So there's going to be a meeting in Great Falls, Missoula, Helena, and Bozeman. Unfortunately, it sounds like there won't be remote participation options for these, but there will be another round of public meetings later this spring with the Public Service Commission, and there's an opportunity to submit comments online as well. And it sounds like comments will be limited to 3 minutes at these meetings. So mark your calendars, and then we'll dive in. And kind of where we're going to head with this presentation, for those that aren't familiar with the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, a little bit of context for what this is and what is contained in it. Dive into some of the issues that we see in the plan as it's drafted. I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds, but hopefully not lose you all too much, just to look at some of the modeling results and what actually is in this IRP, and then kind of get back out of the weeds at the end, and then pass it on to Kyle, who's going to talk about some specific issues that I think is worth having some more detail and context on. So what is the IRP? So Northwestern Energy makes this integrated resource plan every 3 years. It's an iterative process, but the plan is for the next 20 years of how they're going to meet the needs of the energy system. This isn't unique to Northwestern. This is a process that utilities do across the country. So the Northwestern's last IRP came out in 2023, and now we're in 2026, and we have the current iteration. They've posted their draft. They're going to be taking input and posting or filing supposedly a final draft, the Public Service Commission, at the end of April. And so right now we have an opportunity to see what's in it and give feedback to hopefully improve that product. And one thing I want to, I guess, clarify up front, because this is going to come up a little bit, is kind of what the IRP is structured to look at currently. So there's these two things that gets a little wonky, but there's energy versus capacity. And what Northwestern is looking at in the IRP is specifically on the coldest day of the year, meeting the instantaneous amount of energy that they need, or the capacity. And just a little bit of an analogy. So if you think of, say, a faucet in a bathtub, the total energy that you would consume or be delivered to Montana customers is going to be the total amount of, say, gallons or water in the tub, but the capacity is the instantaneous flow of water out of the faucet. So a lot of what this IRP is looking at is that one day in winter when hopefully, despite the winter we've been having so far, it gets very cold. There is a really high instantaneous need for capacity, instantaneous power. And that's what they're designing the model for. And there's a lot of ways that's been structured that leaves out other opportunities for being able to provide that reliable power without having excess generation on a system just to meet that one day of the year when we need it. So effectively, what the IRP is it's a modeling exercise that's creating a model of the energy system and looking at potential ways to meet needs as they arise. But what's really important in recognizing that it's just modeling is there's a lot of influence on the outcomes based on how the model is designed. And I just wanted to highlight a couple things that I'm going to mention again, but there's an idea of what are we assuming. So one assumption that we see in some of the IRP results is that even if Colstrip retires, customers would still be paying for the total capex of that investment until 2042, plus the return on that investment, which I would argue is not a realistic assumption given the way that would actually be handled should the Colstrip plant retire. And I'll talk a little more about that. As well as inputs, what are we saying the cost of resources are? How much can those resources contribute to that peak capacity need? The constraints of the system. One constraint that we see in the IRP is NorthWestern. While they do model battery storage, which is an important improvement, I think, from the previous IRP, there are limitations put on how much batteries can be built, and that limits what the model is able to do. And then finally, what is the goal of the IRP? And that gets back to this instantaneous capacity, that peak need in the winter, and how NorthWestern looks at us being able to actually get there. And one piece of context that I wanted to highlight, we talk about this a lot, but I think it's important in the context of the IRP, is that NorthWestern is a monopoly investor-owned utility, and as such, they're structured to maximize profit to their shareholders. So that is kind of an underpinning in all of the things they do, but I think that it's important to keep in mind when NorthWestern is tasked to plan the most cost-effective 20-year resource portfolio, there's this perverse incentive structure underlying all of that. So I'll get into kind of, hopefully on the surface, some of the main issues that we've seen so far in reviewing the draft IRP and the modeling, and then get a little more into details on some things. The first is that, as we'll see, the model that NorthWestern runs really does not choose to build wind and solar in most scenarios. So we're looking at the next 20 years, and NorthWestern is creating model runs that are very heavy on gas build out, maintaining the Colstrip plant, as well as eventually replacing the Colstrip plant with nuclear power, which is extremely expensive and not a resource that's currently even available. As well as certain ways the model is structured that potentially make it try to meet a bigger capacity need than we actually do. That one day of the year when it's the coldest, building out even more power, even more generation than we would actually need to reliably supply power year round. Another really significant issue with this IRP is it essentially completely ignores climate change and any analysis of existing impacts or how NorthWestern can reduce its contributions to it. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the barriers to transparency and public participation that we've seen in the development of the IRP. I'll note that a lot of these things have been improved, but there's still a lot of more room to increase access to this process. So this first piece, wind and solar, I'm just going to go through a number of ways the model is set up that leads to the overall largely exclusion of building wind and solar in the future. So the first piece here is pretty nuanced, but it's related to how much electricity you say that a given resource will provide on that coldest day of the year. So each resource Northwestern has in its portfolio, it gives a certain accredited capacity value. And it is fair to assume that if you have say a 50 megawatt solar system, if it's cloudy on the coldest day of the year, you're not going to be able to rely on that. So there is a lot that goes into figuring out what these resources can contribute to the portfolio. But on the other side of that, the way that these inputs are made for Northwestern's thermal resources, that would be coal and gas. They say those are almost 100% available on that coldest day of the year, when we've seen historically issues with the Colstrip coal plant when it gets extremely cold. We've seen issues with gas supply and gas equipment that really would indicate that all resources face these issues in extreme conditions, and that isn't completely reflected. And the other part of that is while we look at specifically wind and solar, and even the model does look at how wind can be combined with short-term batteries and how solar can be combined with short-term batteries, there's a lot of other kind of wider complementary effects that aren't captured, such as how wind and solar together are complementary. They often generate at different times of the day. In addition to Northwestern does do some modeling around long duration storage, but doesn't look at how long duration storage could be combined with wind or solar to improve their reliability. And there's also not any look at the regional complementary value of renewables, where if we have access to, say, solar in the Southwest, how can that be an interregional complementary factor? I've mentioned earlier, but one, I would say, pretty big issue is that there is a constraint put on how much Northwestern can build wind and solar or storage resources, so short and long resource duration storage resources. You'll see when I get into some of the modeling, these are, since Northwestern did model batteries, the model shows how essential they are to a reliable system, and almost always selected to build as much batteries as they would allow. But since there's a constraint, we're missing out on the opportunity to build even more storage, which might be able to be combined with renewables to build in that reliability. There's also some potential issues around how much Northwestern says it costs to plug in wind and solar to the electric grid. There are real issues with this, but there's opportunities to do this at low cost, especially when replacing retiring assets like Colstrip, that those costs might be avoided. And then the final thing, there's not really a way for the model as it's structured to demonstrate the benefit of being able to build wind and solar really much quicker than other resources. It's kind of put on the same playing field as gas, when you could bring a wind or solar resource on in really a couple years, and you'd be hard pressed to build a new gas plant in less than 5 years at this point. So I'll talk a little more about this capacity need. So that is the instantaneous amount of power or amount of water flowing out of our faucet on that peak demand day of the year. And this is a graph from the IRP showing if you look at these lines, the top black line is what the capacity that Northwestern is shooting to meet. And without getting too into it, you can see the bar chart is the existing amount of capacity that they have to meet that. And I'll talk a little bit about these two different lines based on kind of an overshoot value that Northwestern says they have to get to meet reliability requirements. So one way that it would appear that the amount of capacity Northwestern says it needs doesn't likely line up with how much they actually need is the issue of expiring contracts. So this is that same chart we just looked at, and on the right is what resources are either retiring or the contracts are expiring for Northwestern in the coming 20 years. And effectively, what a lot of these are is Northwestern has existing contracts to meet their needs. And then when that contract is expired, instead of being able to think about, can we enter into a new contract or extend that contract, Northwestern is modeling to just build a resource to replace that. And that's something that in reality of when Northwestern would actually go to build that resource maybe would be corrected because contracts can be bid into that process as an alternative. But it does make you see it is a pretty serious gap, I would say, in these resources are still there, especially the contracts with renewable resources, where maybe they could just extend those contracts instead of building a plant to meet that need. Because when they build a plant, they make more money than if they're contracting with other folks. Another piece is the idea of interregional transmission. And we've been talking a lot about transmission for a while at MEIC, and hopefully folks on this call have joined some of our webinars about that issue. But one thing that's not reflected in the IRP is how having a transmission line, say, into North Dakota or into Idaho, where we can access other regions of energy, would allow us to not have all those resources built in our in Montana for that one day of the year that we need it. And this is something that we've talked about a lot in the process of the IRP, and really think strongly it needs to be addressed to fix that issue. Because one example of this specifically is the North Plains Connector, which is a transmission line being built from eastern Montana into North Dakota. And Northwestern has committed to having 300 megawatts on that line. And they haven't analyzed how that connection to markets over there will be able to provide reliable capacity. But other utilities that are planning to be a part of that line have, and shown that most of it can actually be relied on, at least for those utilities. So say if Northwestern is able to rely on 300 megawatts for North Plains Connector, in this graph we're looking at in 2040, Northwestern is 323 megawatts short. So with this already planned transmission line, that makes the most of the way there. And then if you add the Judith Gap wind farm, which their contract is expiring this year, they're already, by holding everything else equal, they have enough power. Another thing is there's not there's some exploration of demand responses for meeting this peak, but really not in depth and not specifically looking at how they can shift or reduce the peak demand with very specific load shedding activities. So that's an area that can be improved. And I mentioned the planning reserve margin. There's a lot that goes into that, and especially building out more transmission might be able to lower that margin. And then finally, this isn't reflected here. It's more reflected in some of the scenarios, but the issue of data centers and what that's going to mean for the future of our energy need. And then I mentioned climate change earlier, but really the IRP does not have any doesn't do anything with climate change. If you search for climate change in the whole document, it shows up once, and that's in reference to conversations that were brought up by the stakeholder group that this was an important topic that should be covered. But then it proceeds to not address the issue. They didn't do a social cost of greenhouse gas analysis. They do show emissions as they're required for their portfolio, but it's not as granular as it could be. It doesn't tie them all specifically to resources. Northwestern doesn't do any planning around climate resiliency or adaptation planning. And I think what is really important to highlight is none of the scenarios that Northwestern looks at. So they ran probably about 18 scenarios, but none of them would actually bring them in line with being net zero by 2050, despite the net zero vision that Northwestern came out with in the last number of years. And this is just a chart that shows the emissions of the base case scenario in Northwestern's planning, where they do have quite a few emissions through the planning period, and then you see them drop when Colstrip retires, when Northwestern plans in 2042. And then this last piece, barriers we've encountered for public participation and transparency. Like I mentioned, there has been more access, but the way we started, Northwestern brought together its planning committee without public access, and we've really had to kind of work our way back into this process. So there could certainly be improvement in just full public participation and stakeholder engagement throughout the process. There's been pretty minimal access to materials and agendas and minutes for those meetings. There's not very adequate representation on Northwestern's technical advisory committee. And the process still largely feels to be kind of one directional, where Northwestern, especially the executives, have this idea of where they're going, and then kind of feed that down through the IRP process rather than it being the collaborative opportunity for folks to engage as it should be. And then the final thing I wanted to note is that Northwestern does face a really important decision coming up soon of two competing energy markets that it will likely join, one or the other. We've talked about this some in previous webinars and some of our down-to-earth articles, and I'd encourage folks to read up on it more. But what it would be really helpful in this IRP would be an analysis of the costs and benefits of joining either of those markets, because right now, despite Northwestern doing a lot of this internally, there's not the public doesn't have access to any of that. So we've covered a lot, and I'm gonna touch on the IRP, some of the IRP results. Like I mentioned earlier, this gets pretty complicated. I might have to just kind of breeze through some of the things, but hopefully y'all can hang on for the ride here. So starting with the base case, and we've seen this before, but this is kind of the underlying scenario that the rest of the IRP is kind of comes off of. And to meet these needs that Northwestern is showing it needs, it creates this model that shows over the coming 20 years, this is what we're going to build and when we're going to build it. So you'll see here in the base case, they say they're going to build 250 megawatts of gas, 640 megawatts of nuclear at the end of the planning period. And like I mentioned before, the model does choose as much storage as it can, because that's a really effective resource. So that's kind of the way it's structured. I'm gonna just pass through a number of these. Northwestern does model a few different opportunities for Colstrip to retire early, but I want to highlight some issues that we've seen with this. So there's a scenario where it retires in 2029. There's a scenario it retires in 2031, as well as in this one, you do see there is a little bit of wind and solar at the end, and then a 2035 retirement. And this is kind of the compressed view of the resources NorthWestern is showing it would build to replace Colstrip in those different scenarios. What we see circled here is gas and nuclear. So predominantly, NorthWestern is looking to gas and nuclear to replace the facility. And then again, just wanted to highlight that battery storage is very prevalent in all of these. And then another piece that NorthWestern looks at is the total cost of building all these things. And this is a pretty complicated graph, but I want to draw your attention to a few things. So this is some of those same scenarios we're looking at where Colstrip is retiring in different timelines. If you look at this circled part, that's the total cost of the base case portfolio over the next 20 years, $5.6 billion. And NorthWestern has highlighted in the executive summary upfront that based on the results of our modeling, retiring Colstrip early is going to be more expensive than running it the whole way. And I think there's a number of flaws with that. One thing I want to point out, I mentioned this at the beginning, but included in these costs is the full cost of the Colstrip plant plus 10% return on equity. So they do take out the operations and maintenance and the fuel costs should the plant retire, but effectively we would still be paying for a plant that we're not using in addition to the replacement power. So it goes almost without saying that that's going to cost more. And this is from the recent rate case showing that the amount that we still need to pay for the rate base for Colstrip is about $256 million. And there's ways we have in Montana to, should that plant no longer be used and useful, to refinance that and change the burden on ratepayers because we shouldn't be paying for that. And I wanted to show another angle of what's not in the costs. So on the right is just how it's after 20 years, the costs that still remain to pay off what is built in the plan. So if you look, if Colstrip retires in 2029, we actually have very few costs remaining relatively after those 20 years because most of it is being paid for upfront. If it's retiring later, there's more costs left because we've built those replacements later on. And then 2035, again, it's a little more. And then if you look at retiring in 2043, the base case, or 2042, we still have a tremendous amount of costs left to cover because we built a bunch of SMRs at the end of it. And that's just showing here in the base case when we build, if we build SMRs in 2043, there's still all these costs because if the way that the total portfolio cost is being calculated is just that 20-year period. So if you build nuclear in 2043, then you capture amortizing it over only those first 3 years. So you'd say, if you're going to pay off the plant in 30 years, only the first 3 years are reflected in the total cost of the portfolio. And the remainder of the cost is this remaining book value that isn't part of that total portfolio. And I wanted to finish that just highlighting a study that came out from RMI, specifically looking at Colstrip, and the findings was we can replace Colstrip with wind, solar, and storage and maintain reliability and lower costs to customers. So I think that there's just other ways that aren't reflected in the modeling to do this. And the last thing I'm going to touch on is data centers, because this is something that we've been talking about a lot and I think is on a lot of people's minds. And this is something that NorthWestern looks at in some different scenarios, but the main story is if they're looking at 150 megawatts, 650 megawatts, or 1160 megawatts. So just like 3 different amounts of additional data centers. I would say that the amount of data centers that have been announced in Montana actually far exceeds this largest scenario. And we just see as if they add more data centers, they are building more gas and more nuclear to facilitate that. Associated with that, the emissions of that portfolio increase. If they build 1,000 megawatts of data centers, the total emissions over 20 years is double what it would be in the base case. And then finally, you increase all these assets, the total cost of the portfolio is also going to increase. And there is nuance to that because there's how is that distributed? And there's been a lot of talk about if we increase load, we can actually lower costs. And there's some truth to that in specific scenarios. If you are utilizing existing infrastructure, then yes, maybe you can lower the per customer cost, but it's important how you do that. And it shows that if we build this higher end of data centers that they're looking for, the total per megawatt hour cost on the system does increase. And of course, it matters who is paying for that. This was a study that came out looking at some of these issues, the factors influencing prices that people have been pointing to saying, oh, look, if you grow demand, then you're actually going to decrease costs. But another finding of that study was that the increase to customers' costs to ratepayer bills that we've been seeing has been impacting residential customers more, as well as customers of investor-owned utilities. So when looking at data centers, it's important to look at how do different classes of customers cover those costs, and are we shifting that burden from, say, the large data centers to the residential customers? Because even if the overall per megawatt hour system cost might decrease, that doesn't necessarily mean residents are going to pay less, and they may very well be paying more. And in those high build out scenarios, we just see that the total cost of the system do increase. So thank you for bearing with me. That was a lot. Just recapping that initial slide of those issues with the IRP, as well as putting this slide up again for the meetings we have coming up. And I mentioned there's going to be meetings in the spring. And with that, I will pass it off to Kyle to fill in some gaps and talk a little more about transmission and what other folks are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, for having me. Pleasure to join you all and speak to this IRP. I'd commend not only Nick for an excellent presentation and a deep dive on many important subjects, but you all for being ambitious enough to try to bite this off in an hour. It's just a lot to cover. So thanks again, Nick, for putting this together and trying to go as far as we can. I thought I'd just speak to a number of different items that Nick touched on. I believe all of these he touched on, but maybe I'll go a little deeper on some of them. One is to start with, just to put in context what the IRP is and does. As Nick mentioned, it's a modeling exercise to quantify the annual energy and peak load requirements that NorthWestern needs to meet into the future and what capacity position it anticipates it will be in at different points in the future, as Nick spoke to. Another thing that's important to acknowledge is even though the IRP is selecting typically a preferred portfolio of resources that the company anticipates would fulfill their capacity requirements, it is not prescriptive insofar as it would require that those resources be procured. So that's to say, the IRP is followed by an RFP, and that RFP will lay out those capacity needs that the company identified in the IRP, but it will not, it's what we call an all source RFP. It'll be receptive to any resource which can show up and meet those needs cost effectively. And then obviously in the RFP context, those resources will have to compete with each other on cost and other attributes in order to win. So just keep that in mind as we go through. That's not to say the IRP isn't important. It is. But it's only important insofar as it quantifies or describes those capacity needs into the future and how those capacity needs might be met insofar as that will inform the RFP. So with all that in mind, I also wanted to point out um, that Northwestern is making improvements. I mean, if you've been tracking Northwestern's IRP for a number of years, you'll notice that this IRP has some discussion and sections on things that just weren't discussed before. And I think it's worth acknowledging those improvements. Some of them, again, that are novel in this IRP for Northwestern are ample discussion around the at least the abstract or potential benefits of transmission connectivity to the rest of the region. I think that was super positive to see. I would agree with Nick that they need to go further. I'll speak to that more in a moment, but to see that discussion was good. Um, we also saw a more sophisticated approach to load forecasting. I'd say, at least for myself and my organization, we didn't have a lot of confidence in previous load forecasts because they didn't have inputs that we see common among other utilities. Whereas this time there were more inputs that made, again, the forecast more sophisticated and more reliable into the future. So that was also super positive to see. And as it pertains to load forecasts, they're very important. Again, like your capacity, the company's capacity position is only half of the equation. The other half is the load forecast. So if you get the load forecast wrong, we're in big trouble. So anyway, a good improvement there. And then there was also, this has been discussed in previous IRPs, but I think they did go deeper, talking about the benefits of RAP, considering the regional nature of the electricity system, the risks to the region. All of that discussion was positive. So, all that being said, I'd encourage you all to note those or other positive attributes of the plan. Some shortcomings, just getting back to Nick's points that I wanted to speak to. We have a big concern around the technology costs that were used. So when the company is trying to identify a cost-efficient, reliable portfolio to meet its capacity needs, what it assumes for technology costs, again, is a primary driver of what it's going to find is an efficient solution for their portfolio. And unfortunately, for wind, solar, and batteries in particular, we found that the company's estimates per what we would consider industry standard, i.e., NREL's ATB, were just way higher. So that's to say, wind generation on day one, the day one overnight CapEx was 20% higher for wind, 15% higher for solar, and 50% higher for BESS on day one. And then if you go down and look at the cost curves versus NREL's projections, the numbers are even starker. Wind generation, Northwestern is using costs that are 43% higher, solar 47% higher, BESS 86% higher by 2036. So that's that cost curve 10 years out. These numbers get even more exaggerated, the differential between Northwestern's estimates and NREL's. Northwestern did contract out these cost estimates. However, of course, that's no excuse for having poor cost estimates. We still have to critique these and acknowledge that they're a major input into the model. And I'll also mention I was these benchmarks where Northwestern is, today anywhere between 20 to 50% too high on these resources, and in 10 years anywhere between 40 and 90% too high. Um, that's versus NREL numbers. NREL is relatively conservative as far as industry projections go. That's to say, Woodmac, BNEF, and Lazard are all lower than NREL estimates. So anyway, we think the costs are too high, and that's a major misstep in the modeling. Another issue I'd bring up that relates, but in a different way, and I'd actually tie it back to Nick's discussion around climate change and sort of a lack of discussion around climate change. I mean, to be clear, Northwestern doesn't have a statutory obligation to consider climate change. I would assume most of us on the call would agree they should, and there are reasons that they should. And so, um, since they don't have that statutory obligation, the PSC therefore has no or at least they would say the sitting PSC would say that they have no obligation to evaluate whether or not Northwestern is considering climate change in the course of its IRP modeling or considerations. And so, but there are issues we can point to that are related and essentially track back to carbon and climate. Um, and I characterize these as the economic reliability, regulatory, and legal risks associated with thermal generation. So that's to say, Nick pointed to this earlier, but I'll just fill it out a little bit more. Northwestern has experienced significant reliability problems with both coal and gas generation in recent peak periods. That's to say, whereas the RAP winter accreditation value for gas is 98%, meaning we would expect 98% of the nameplate to show up in those peak hours. I was just going to pull up a number here. What we've actually seen in the two most recent winter peaks is an average output for gas of 73% capacity. And not only that, in December 2022, gas output in the two peak hours when Northwestern's load was at its historic peak of the time was below 50% output in those two peak hours. So while recognizing, we applaud Northwestern's participation in the RAP program, wouldn't necessarily argue they should use ELCCs other than the RAP ELCCs. However, there's no discussion in the IRP around these material reliability risks for gas generation that have been demonstrated and are likely to be repeated in the IRP. So, uh, that's something to keep in mind. That's reliability risk of thermal generation. The economic risk sort of hits closer to the climate issue. So that's to say, well, and regulatory and legal risks. So one other thing to point out is a portfolio that's heavy on thermals and light or extremely light on wind and solar uh, is going to result in a generation stack that has relatively high marginal operating cost. And that's a problem into the future because across the West and the Western interconnection and the markets in which Northwestern is a part, there are many gigawatts of wind, solar, and storage being built every year. And so those wind, solar, and storage resources are going to run at extremely low marginal operating cost, such that if they are sufficient to meet load at any given time, the thermal resources will not run. And insofar as there are more wind, solar, and storage resources built, the thermal resources will run less and less, to the point that it's not unreasonable to think that before long, let's say 10, 15, 20 years into the future, well within the scope of this IRP, uh, there are thermal resources that could be unused or unuseful, and it would not justify their investment. So, that's to say, due to a falling average cost of power on the market from clean resources being deployed at scale, there's an economic risk to building thermals on Montana's system. And then the last point I'd make is, and Northwestern has already seen this risk manifest, and that's climate change is happening. The IPCC has documented that it's caused by greenhouse gas emissions from human activities, and that a rapid uh, decrease in those emissions is necessary to avoid harm in every region of the world to all people. And as a result of that, many regulatory bodies are enacting regulations to limit emissions. And that happened in the United States. The EPA issued regulations that likely would have shut down Colstrip in the 2030s. And Nick and Ann can speak in a much deeper way to those regulations and the status and the effects. But suffice it to say that the fact that CO2 and other particulate emissions contribute to global warming is in itself a regulatory risk that needs to be factored in the course of resource planning, and it's not factored in this IRP. So that's also a major shortcoming. The last thing I'll touch on very quickly, know we need time for questions, is just that this regional transmission connectivity can itself be attributed a capacity value. So that's to say it can offset the need for building other generating resources. And we believe that Northwestern and every other utility ought to be modeling transmission in that way. So whereas Northwestern did speak to the value of transmission in a general way, they did not attribute a capacity value to it. And that resulted in the need for more, let's say, conventional generation resources than it should actually need if it pursues ownership of North Plains Connector or other interjurisdictional transmission. I'll stop there. Thanks everyone for listening. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kyle. And just before we get into questions, I know that Derek is joining us with Northwest Energy Coalition. And if you have anything you want to add, since you've been a part of this stakeholder group, feel free to.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Kyle. Both of you great points. And I'll just touch briefly, since we didn't go too deeply into it on the demand side management. I don't think it'll surprise anyone here that Northwestern Energy does a relatively crappy job on energy efficiency and conservation programs, which is, you could really think of that stuff as kind of the low-hanging fruit, and the lowest cost energy that they could get is the energy that is saved. And they can spend more money in promoting their programs and marketing their efficiency and conservation programs to their customers to acquire more of those savings. Unfortunately, even compared to other utilities, peer utilities in the region, they do a really bad job. They set a low bar and they achieve very little. Unfortunately, in this IRP, looking forward, they're cutting back their demand side management, their efficiency and conservation acquisition targets by one half to two-thirds of what they've achieved each year over the last decade. So that's one of the really disappointing things we're seeing in here, is how they're even lowering the bar for conservation and efficiency even further, below their already low targets. One element of that is something called demand response, which is how you have customers during periods of a peak demand event, such as the January 2024 winter weather event, something like that, calling on your customers to reduce their own demand on the system, whether they're residential customers who you ask to charge their electric vehicles to put that off by a few hours, or commercial and industrial customers who you ask to curtail their demand. There's other utilities do these demand response programs. Northwestern Energy has no demand response program at all, and they say this. And so that they're not planning in this IRP to create and expand a demand response program is another shortcoming, and I think a major one, given that they're using the whole IRP is based on having the capacity for these peak energy need events. So we're definitely planning on, commenting on that and pushing back on that, because we feel for a long time that they've needed to do a lot more.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, definitely the demand side is a really important part of the equation. So thanks everyone for sticking with us this long. We now have a bit of time for questions. Hopefully we can keep things brief and moving along to cover as much as we can before we reach the end of the call. So feel free to raise your hand or put questions in the chat.
Could I ask Derek? Oh, sorry. Gary's first.
Ah, thank you, Gary. Go ahead. And Gary is also part of the stakeholder group.
Yeah, okay. So as one of the, I'm not sure that are you hearing me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So how likely is it that return on equity can be changed for Northwestern? So, and I guess one idea would be to make the return on equity better for renewables than it is for fossil fuels. But I don't know who regulates that return on equity and whether or not it can be changed.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, the allowed return on equity is set by the PSC in a rate case. And specifically for like Colstrip, what I was talking about, and Ann could probably even speak to this more, but we do have legislation in Montana that allows for what's called securitization of a stranded asset. So you could change the amount of return and how much Northwestern would recover for an asset that's not being used. And similarly for, say, a wind or solar facility, that return would be set in a rate case.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Could I have Derek just mention advanced meters? We are, as customers, are paying for these advanced meters, and couldn't they be helping with demand response since we paid for them? And isn't that kind of part of their purpose?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Actually, I don't, they haven't put one on my house yet, but supposedly they're putting out these advanced meter infrastructures to their customers, which should allow them to get a better sense of real-time energy usage per household or per customer. But it's a real question since we're paying for them. Like Ann said, are they just sitting there, or should Northwestern Energy be required to actually develop programs to conserve electricity using this technology that we're paying for? Um, so it's a really good point. I don't, like I said, they don't have a demand response program.
Definitely. Jim.
Oh, thanks. Uh, I see that there's a pretty heavy reliance on batteries. And um, has anyone looked at hydraulic pumping, which is a technology that's been around a long, long time and it's well proven. And you have in the state of Montana many grade changes that would work very, very well. Additionally, have you ever heard of, gravity recovery systems like those used by Gravitricity in Edinburgh?
Right. Yeah, I think that pumped hydro is definitely a storage resource that I think could be considered. I don't know, and Kyle or Derek, you can chime in. I don't know if that's a part of the long duration analysis or if they're specifically modeling like a long duration battery in the IRP, but yeah, I guess if you want to chime in, Kyle.
It was both, Nick. I believe they did ascribe a cost to pumped hydro as well as like iron air battery.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Oh, additionally, Butte is one of the best places in the whole planet for using a system that would raise and lower a big weight into a mine shaft. So it's like, it's similar to a hydraulic pumping. And I've been talking with the company in Edinburgh, and they're very excited about the mine shaft in Butte that's 1,640 meters deep. That would accommodate their max performance unit, which is 2 megawatts.
Sure.
It's all the work is done. You just have to have a way to lift it up and bring it
Definitely.
down.
Yeah. And that would be a good thing to highlight to Northwestern in the comments for their public meetings and on their online
Great.
forum. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Because they're very eager to talk to somebody, and I've tried very hard to find anyone in Montana that's interested in something like that. So
Great.
be great. Okay, it's all set. They're waiting to hear from us. Thanks a
Yeah.
lot.
All right. I see Mary.
Hi, thank you. Not to be cynical, but given the business model that NorthWestern Energy operates under, I'm just curious as to why we think that our advocacy is going to have an impact. I mean,
Yeah.
again, not to be too cynical, but I'd like to hear what
You know,
leverage do we have with NorthWestern Energy?
it's a great question, and I think worth asking. And I guess I'll say a couple things, but there are requirements that Northwestern has to meet in this plan, and a lot of those are written into statute. A lot of those are in the administrative rules around planning for the least cost portfolio. And if we're pointing out ways that Northwestern has fallen short of its requirements, whether Northwestern actually takes that into account, or if we then take that to the Public Service Commission when they have their public meetings, there's certainly a really important opportunity here to bring up these issues in the forums available to us, because eventually the IRP that Northwestern finishes with is going to be leading to what resources they try to build, and down the road, eventually, should they be able to charge customers for resources they built? Did they follow a good process? And I would highlight that in the current rate case that just wrapped up, unfortunately, Northwestern did build the Yellowstone County Generating Station gas plant, but they didn't get to charge customers for the full amount for that plant. And in that review from the commission and especially commission staff, they pointed all the way back to the 2019 IRP, where there were issues that this plant was not chosen fairly through the process. So it's important for us to engage now, because this plays out to the future of the energy system. And the more we can really get at these specific issues of why it could be better, I think will push us in the right direction. And happy to let anyone else, Anne or others, chime in if they have additional thoughts.
I'd say something real quick, and thanks for the question, Mary. The company does have a legislative mandate to develop a least cost reliable portfolio. So if there are reasons to believe that the IRP does not represent a least cost reliable portfolio, then it's very much the company's duty to take note of those issues and address them. Similarly, it's the PSC's duty to consider those issues and question the company regarding them. So insofar as you can make arguments like the ones we presented to you today around why this IRP may not be least cost or reliable, then they'd be obliged to listen.
And while Mary, I just want to jump in here quickly that while I have no faith in our utility to actually do the right thing on these issues these days, I do believe in the process and I do believe in the long game. And even though, if we speak up, the utility either fails to listen to us at its own peril, because there are consequences for it not doing what it's obligated to do under the law, what it's obligated to do under our constitutional right to a clean, healthful environment. And it may not be in this particular document in which we're able to carry that enforcement of those requirements through. But when they come back to look for cost reimbursement from ratepayers in future proceedings, like Kyle just mentioning the IRP from 2019 and the recent rate case, we are going to be there to continue to say, we told you that this was not least cost. We told you that this wasn't going to work. We told you that you're ignoring the statute and you're ignoring the Constitution. And if the Public Service Commission continues to ignore our concerns about those things, we have the right to go to court, and we will go to court. This is the long game. We're not going to beat Northwestern at its little game of charging us as much money as it can for things that we don't want or need or that are destructive for our environment. But we will get there because we're not going to give up. So I get your frustration. I share it, but this is the long game.
Thank you.
And it just also seems that there's also the court of public opinion that is shifting around utilities. They used to be like very, supportive and popular. So, Mary, I think the other point is like, what's the news article going to look like the next day if we all show up and kind of bash them? What comes out in some of the more respected news? That seems also important to continue that long game.
Definitely. Well, it looks like that brings
Can
us.
I just address one thing?
Sure.
I see a lot of interest in data centers in the chat, and I just want to thank people for that. It is one of the most pressing issues we're finding right now. This IRP has a lot to do with data centers, and we are going to find ourselves with way more power than we need, and it's all going to be serving data centers, but we're going to be charged for it. People are coming out of the woodwork to protest data centers. I encourage you to participate in those. We have held public meetings in a number of locations. In fact, last night we had a public meeting in October, and last night the Butte Silver Bow commissioners voted unanimously to send a letter to the Public Service Commission on data centers saying you need to regulate them to protect existing customers. That's a big win, and that's the kind of victory that we should be seeing in every single community. Everybody should be going to their local government and asking them to start engaging in this issue because our power bills are going to go up. We are going to lose water resources. So I want to thank people for showing up and being concerned about data centers. And I want you to know that we're going to be coming to a community near you with the same type of panel presentation we've been doing around the state in the next couple months. And we have Katie's dropping a number of things in the chat, but we have a lot of extensive resources on our website regarding data centers. And stay tuned. And if you're not on our action alert system, you should get on it because we will let you know when there are opportunities to push back against the richest men in America trying to make us subsidize their power and taking our water for their data centers without any transparency. So stay tuned, engage, and thank you. We really appreciate you being here.
Of course, yes. Thank you all. I'm mindful that we're a little over the time here. And thanks for sticking through these conversations. And we hope to see you at one of these public events coming up for Northwestern's IRP in the next couple of weeks.